Welcome to the Kolbecast, episode 212. Thank you for joining us. Today, Bonnie and I are joined by a voice that many Kolbe families will be familiar with, Abigail Palmer, teacher, author, and presenter in Kolbe's classic conference recordings. From teaching tips to a love of the classics and inspiring wonder through historical fiction, Abigail is sure to inspire a love of learning and teaching the classics to all of our listeners. We hope that you'll enjoy the show.
Hi there, I'm Bonnie, Kolbe homeschooling mom of 4 lads and lasses, liturgical musician, popcorn, and podcast fanatic.
And this is Stephen, homeschooling father of 5 and chief homeschooling officer for Kolbe Academy.
How's your day going, Stephen?
My day is going well. I'm looking forward to this conversation that we're about to have here.
I know. Our guest today actually might feel very familiar to many of our listeners. I'm trying to think of the movie from which I heard this line, but hers is a voice I know almost as well as my own. I have listened to her recordings I don't know how many times. Today we have with us Mrs. Abigail Palmer, who is the speaker on the Kolbe Classics Conference recordings that our Greek and Roman literature and history students often use as part of their coursework. Welcome to the Kolbecast, Abigail.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
We're really delighted to get to visit with you today. As I mentioned, I've been listening to your recordings, I myself, as a preparation to help my students through their studies, to have a sense of what they're learning, even though they have taken these courses online. So I figured there are a lot of folks out there who are similarly familiar with you. Would you take us back to maybe the starting point of those classics conference recordings that we're referring to, and then widen the lens and tell us a bit about yourself?
Sure, yeah. So it's now over 20 years ago, and it's pretty amazing for me. And it was my first year of teaching. So I graduated from University of Dallas, and I thought I'd like to go to grad school, but I wasn't quite sure. And so I got this job at Kolbe Academy, the day school in Napa. And at first, when I heard about the job, I thought, oh, I don't really want to move to California. I had family in Louisiana and in Texas. And I thought, I kind of want to stay a little closer for my first job right out of college. But I flew out here to look at the school and look at the job. And I realized it was the perfect first teaching job, really small class size, very supportive. It was in my field, which a lot of classics majors, you might not get that experience, that opportunity. And Napa is amazing. It's beautiful. So I came out here, was like, yes to all 3. And I got off the plane. This was a day when you could still meet people at the gate, right? I got off the plane with my contract, and my mom was there, and yay, I have a job. Yeah, very good news. And so I moved out here, and my first year of teaching, I used the Kolbe, the resources developed both in the day school and homeschool. They had a kind of a symbiotic relationship, right? Like in the day school, they would introduce this great book and then develop materials for it. And the students would use those materials, and they talk about it, and they come up with key points and things like that. And then the tests. So I didn't come up with any of the original written course plans or anything. That I believe was Robert Spencer who came up with those, but I might be wrong. And so I just taught my first year, and I survived. And it probably first year homeschooling, maybe beyond, if you can get through the first year and you still want to do it. And I say I had really excellent mentors. So Marge Karate was like a fabulous teacher, and she gave me so many tips, especially for teaching junior high, that I still use. She was the junior high grammar and English teacher, and I mean, everyone did everything. And Dianne Muth was also super great mentor. Even though they had different styles, they taught different grades, you could go to them with a problem anytime as a first year teacher. And I, just pour your heart out, and they would just listen, and they'd give you strategies. So I felt very supported. And at the end of the first school year, the current principal said, hey, you've taught this Greek year with this class. Next year is the Roman year. How about we do a conference? Plan it, like, I think, around the homeschool graduation for the homeschool, and invite people to come to the conference and record it. So that hadn't really been done before. We tried to record some of my classroom lectures, but it doesn't, like if you recorded your day-to-day stuff, it would be like, where's your pencil? You have to go to the bathroom again?
That's
You
right.
just went to the bathroom.
Shudder to
So
think through that. Yeah.
he was like, this isn't working. So we just recorded the conference. It was all summer after my first year of teaching, and developed the materials. I had incoming freshmen, rising eighth graders who were going to be freshmen who were there for the conference. So they got to hear the Greek materials and Roman materials because they were going to be joining us in a Roman year. And I heard from parents it really did help them. And after that, I just kind of kept going, right? Like I taught my second year, and then I went to graduate school at Fordham and got my master's and came back, and I wrote a lot of curriculum for Kolbe at that point, and then returned to the classroom. Oh gosh, in 2007 or 2008. So at a different school north of Napa. So, and I've been there ever since, but still, like, my older son goes to Kolbe Day School, goes to Trinity, and, still lots of friends and connections, and, talk to the homeschool, quite a bit still. So that's kind of the history of it. And it was not a high-tech recording. We didn't have a recording studio. We're in if you see the picture of the homeschool and all the, branding, that we're just in there, and the parents and the students who came, and then we'd have lunch together, and it was really nice. It was nice to meet some of the homeschool families from the Bay Area and see their reactions to it. The materials that, I'll talk a little bit about this later, but it's the kind of materials that lend themselves to conversations. So, we talk about the Greeks all morning, and then we'd have lunch together, and the parents and the high schoolers having conversations together, like all of us together, having these conversations. And that's one of the benefits of studying the classics.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's a brief background.
You obviously, I think your degree was in classics from the University of Dallas, right? So you had an interest in this from before this time, when did that start? When did you fall in love with the classics?
Well, okay, I'm going to try to keep it really fast, but I'll tell you a story that's kind of funny. But my dad went to Jesuit high school in New Orleans. They were really influential on him and the direction of his life, as the Jesuits can be. And he started taking Latin. And when I was a sixth grader, he was like, guess what? We're doing this summer, we're going to learn Latin. And he busted out Henley Latin, which is what he used because it's a Jesuit textbook. And you're going to sit here at the table with me. He was like, we were bonding, right? But I was already pretty awkward and was afraid that I would be weird, right? At that age, you're kind of like, oh no, I don't want to stick out in any way at all.
Yeah.
So I mentioned to one of my friends, my dad's going to start teaching me Latin. She was like, oh my gosh, that's awesome. Can I learn too? And I was like, well, maybe it'll be more fun with her, if we're both there at the table. And so we started doing Latin together. And she loved it and was like smarter than I was and doing better. But I really did like it secretly. And then she started telling me how when she'd go home, she had on her wall, because she was a huge Star Trek fan, all the like Star Trek characters, and how she would remember how to decline nouns by like Spock is Puella and Kirk is Puelli. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so nerdy. This is like, what am I doing here? If word of this gets out, I'm like, done for. I loved her in spite of the Star Trek stuff, but Star Trek and Latin together was, and I told my dad, I don't want to do it anymore. I don't like Latin. And it was just like, preteen rebellion. And so the school I went to didn't have Latin anyway. I think he got over it, because then when I ended up going to a different high school, it was a very big public high school that had a lot to offer. So had 4 years of Latin, had Japanese, had great, performing arts program. And it went really well for me. And I got into taking Latin, not from my dad, right? From that point on, that same friend years later, she ended up going into science, and she's like, I'm not sure, she's doing something very scientific. It's engineering, but she actually called me out of the blue because she went to a different high school than I did. And she said, well, there's this school that I went to visit called University of Dallas. For me, I want a science school. She wanted like an engineering school, but she's like, not for me, but I thought of you and I thought you might like it. And so I hadn't heard of it. I was living in Montana at the time. There's not, when my freshman year at UD, when we all stood in the different parts of the map where we were from, so we could meet who was from our area, I was the only person in my state. I'm like standing up there at the top of the map. And I just went and joined the Coloradans after a while. It's like, it's lonely in
Close enough.
Montana. And there's all the people from Chicago, and there's all the people from Virginia, and so I had no opportunity to really learn about University of Dallas. But it's all really providential because I went and I took the classics scholarship exams and met the classics department, which is still very dear to my heart, and it's just a wonderful department at University of Dallas. And got in, and it was really wonderful. Had a great experience there. So I kept studying Latin, and then I studied Greek as well. Ended up really enjoying Greek, and yeah. And then, of course, all the rest of the core at University of Dallas too. So that gave me a background as well. But that little classics department, I can't recommend it more highly to people whose students are interested in classics. So yeah, that's how it all kind of began.
So when people find out that you have a classics background, is that sort of the door opening for you to explain like what's a classics, why the classics even on a broader level, all that whole thing, like folks who are unfamiliar with the classics, where do you like to start there?
Oh, all the time. It's interesting because, if you tell someone you're a finance major, I don't think you're going to get a strong reaction. But for some reason, when people find out you're a classics major, at least in my experience, when you're at like a cocktail party or something, you tend to get either very strong positive reactions or very strong negative reactions. And the very strong positive reactions are like, oh my gosh, that's great. I studied Latin. I loved it. And the negative reactions are, what's the point of that? It's useless, arcane information. I was forced to study Latin. I hated it. Totally irrelevant is the message. So I'm very used to that. It's when I was writing my book and I had to pitch it, I'm like, I'm used to selling the classics all the time, because it's like, ever since when you choose that major, you're going to get thrown at you, you'll never have a job, your knowledge is irrelevant. And I think about, well, I'm glad it gets a strong reaction. I'm glad it doesn't get just like a,
That's nice.
On
to the next thing.
People feel strongly about it. And I'm not sure if it's because they are uncomfortable with, they secretly admit that deep down, these works have something to still tell us, and that makes people uncomfortable. I'm not sure what it is. I haven't put my finger on why some high school person wanting to be a classics major should, lead to. But I have heard in the world that parents are actively discouraging their students, their children, from becoming classics majors as undergraduates. And we live in a time where, college degree, it's tricky. What is anyone going to do with a college degree? There's a lot of anxiety out there among parents. And I understand that, and parents want what's best for their children, but it's kind of like, well, it's interesting. I know a classics degree can open the future in any number of directions, and a liberal arts degree in general. I know of one tech company founder in the Bay Area who avoided not to say this is bad, but he really preferred to hire philosophy, classics, humanities majors, because they knew how to think and they could approach problems in a more universal way, I guess is what you could say. And so, yeah, I don't see how a classics degree can set you back if you don't ever want to teach. If you're completely opposed to that, then that might be, a problem. I know a lot of classics majors do end up teaching, but not everyone. And it's not the sign of happiness that you are successful in the tech world. I want to say like you don't become a classics major so you'll own Facebook or something. It's not the point of life, but it is interesting that when you look at how many in the tech world studied and loved Latin, like Mark Zuckerberg or something, he really, really loved it. I think that for people who end up getting into computers, they often really like Latin and Greek because it's a kind of code, right? The inflected endings tell you what to do with that word in the sentence. So it's not at all limiting to go into classics. Graduate school is an option,
Yeah.
museum work is an option, working for an auction house is an option. So yeah.
That was my experience as well. I'm not a classics major, but my second major was an undergraduate degree was civil engineering. But my first one was a liberal arts degree at Thomas Aquinas College. And I always say that I had to get the engineering degree to, check to have the ticket to go
Mhm.
and do the work. But my Thomas Aquinas College, my TAC education was so valuable in that the ability to think through things, the ability to communicate, the ability to enter into debate about thoughts without having it be a personal sort of thing
Mhm.
where, and just the beautiful formation and actually focusing on the truth and things that, that you have. So that was, that's my treasure. Yeah, so I'm on board with what you're saying.
Oh, good.
So for families who are considering classical education in the younger years before college, and they're kind of like, well, why would we want to go the classical route or versus another route? How do you like to approach that with them?
Sure.
Why the classics
Yeah.
for younger students?
So whether we like it or not, like I said, there is discomfort out there, like opposition to this. Whether we like it or not, the classics are still the foundation of our law and our government and our literary and our artistic world. So it's hard to study art without running into a mythological theme from the Greeks or Romans. And there's a message in all of this, right? Why did the artist pick that particular myth? What is he conveying in that myth? And it's kind of hard to go through life being tone deaf to all of that. When we study the Roman Republic and then we look at our Republic, um, it's kind of, the students find it's like a treasure hunt. So you look at the Lincoln Monument Memorial in Washington, D.C., and he's sitting in that chair and he's got his hands on the armrest, but what is on the front of the armrest are the fasces, right? That symbol of the Roman Republic. And they're like, oh, because they know what those mean in the Roman Republic. And then when you look at the House in our government in Washington, D.C., two giant golden fasces behind the Speaker of the House's chair. What is that? Why that art? What are they telling the American people by having those ancient Roman symbols of the Republic on either side of them? So all of this is intentional, and it's going to be hard to, if you pull out the plant and the root, what do you replace it with? So those foundations are there for the understanding, and everything's always referencing back to them, at least in our society, in the Western world. So that's one reason. Another reason is that these primary texts were copied intentionally for centuries, sometimes in really rough conditions. I imagine like, Irish monks clinging to one copy of Plutarch or whatever they have, and here come the Vikings and things like that. Or with my high schoolers, we're looking at the history of manuscript transmission for Catullus, and it got down to one manuscript. And, and so you look at the history of these texts, which were preserved intentionally for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so why? Like, why that you don't spend time hand copying the Iliad for nothing. It's because they were important. So important were they that people spent a large quantity of their lives, a lot of time to make sure that their monastery had a copy, or that their library in Pergamum had a copy from Alexandria. It was important to them. And I think a really important thing for us to keep in mind is that the texts for us now avoid many of the ills of our current nearsightedness. So we're very close to our news, right? And if we don't know where we've come from, and we don't know that these things have happened in some way or another in history, and how did people react then, you are fearful. And if you're fearful, you're malleable. Like, oh my gosh, these are, we heard the word unprecedented for a few years there. And yeah, I think that unprecedented things have happened in our lifetime. But when you start to study the classics, you realize there's not much that's not precedented. Most everything has happened, and it shouldn't make us calloused or, dismissive, or, not feel compassion for people suffering, but you just know that all of this has happened before, and it can be beneficial to us now to step back a bit and say, wait, how did they handle this? How did they handle this war? How did they handle this conflict in their republic? Questions like that. And there's just a few short quotes I'll read. One is by Livy that is right from the very, very beginning of his history of Rome, Ab Urbe Candida. He's talking about why he's chosen to write about ancient Rome. So he says, I am aware too that most readers will take less pleasure in my account of how Rome began and in her early history. They will wish to hurry on to more modern times and to read of the period, already a long one, in which the might of an imperial people is beginning to work its own ruin. My own feeling is different. I shall find antiquity a rewarding study, if only because, while I am absorbed in it, I shall be able to turn my eyes from the troubles which for so long have tormented the modern world, and to write without any of that over-anxious consideration, which may well plague a writer on contemporary life, even if it does not lead him to conceal the truth. So that's right at the beginning. Yeah, we are over-anxious. I think over-anxious is a good word to describe our society right now. And the next thing that comes down the chute through the news cycle is greeted with more anxiety. It doesn't help that we have a 24-hour news cycle, which fortunately Livy was blessed to not have. But yeah, so stepping back a bit and realizing that studying antiquity gives you perspective, and that you can see how problems were handled. Kind of probably because he knew that source. C.S. Lewis talks about this as well in a kind of a more modern perspective. And it's in his introduction to St. Athanasius's On the Incarnation that he talks about this. I just love this quote, and it's related to the Livy quote. C.S. Lewis said, every age has its own outlook. It is especially good at seeing certain truths and especially liable to make certain mistakes. We all, therefore, need the books that will correct the characteristic mistakes of our own period, and that means the old books. All contemporary writers share to some extent the contemporary outlook, even those like myself who seem most opposed to it. Nothing strikes me more when I read the controversies of past ages than the fact that both sides were usually assuming, without any question, a good deal which we should now absolutely deny. We may be sure that the characteristic blindness of the 20th or 21st, you could say, century, the blindness about which posterity will ask, but how could they have thought that, lies where we have never suspected it. None of us shall fully escape this blindness, but we shall certainly increase it and weaken our guard against it if we read only modern books. The only palliative is to keep the clean sea breeze of the centuries blowing through our minds. And this can be done by only reading old books. That's like the best quote ever, right?
Yeah.
Not, of course, that there is any magic about the past. People were no cleverer than they are now. They made as many mistakes as we, but not the same mistakes. So it's just if you're too close to what's going on now, how can you make a good judgment about things, especially when you're being told that what's happening right now has never happened before? To step back and look through the ages, the distance provides some calming, right?
Yeah.
And Yeah, it's scary. It's scary. And like I said, when people are scared, then you stop thinking for yourself. You become malleable. You accept what other people will tell you is the bigger pattern or inevitable. And so just my takeaway from that is the old books contain a full range of human experiences. Not much is unprecedented, actually. And while this fact should not make us callous to the suffering of others or jaded to them, we're not like, like in the Lord of the Rings, the elves sometimes they kind of don't see the risk in things, right? Because they've been around so long. There's like some urgency sometimes, and there's sometimes like, well, this doesn't involve us, right? I'm not, and of course then they'll reflect and then they'll act, right? I'm not saying we become elven in that way, like, these humans and they're always doing these things and we're different. It's not to become that way, but they just give us perspective, the old books. You can think through events calmly and you can think for yourselves. So if you're hearing constantly that our republic is in danger, you can just think, well, what are the characteristics of a republic? Okay, what do you have to have a republic? What is a sign of a sick republic? We have examples, right? That aren't our own. It's not so personal. So yeah, that's just some of it. And then, just what Stephen was saying too, you have this education is like a treasure you can carry with you. And it doesn't get old. This kind of relates to the next point about primary sources being hard, but doesn't get old. You can keep chewing on it. And as I said, kind of my last point about why the classics, it's something that you can talk about with any age from high school on up. Sitting there at the table, talking with people from different places about Athens, should they have gone to war in Sicily? Like, what led them to do that? And you have like, a Vietnam vet with his perspective, and you have a doctor with his perspective, and you have a homeschool mom with her perspective, and you have the high schoolers, and they all have something to contribute because they've all read that same text, and that text has so much to unpack that you can always think about and always think about. So yeah.
Like the extra context that the classics, especially the Greeks, always strike me in this way. But just seeing a pre-Christian world, and how much they focused on virtue and knowledge and the truth, and the things that they're struggling with are things. So you can see all of those similarities and just think about how far they came without Christianity or without Judaism. And yet you can also pick out differences that like, oh, this character is doing something which seems bad. We couldn't do that as a Christian, but it's also different. It's not, I love that you can get a different perspective. People who are seeking the virtue, the good, the true, but without the fullness of the revelation and the incarnation that we have as Catholics. It's a good perspective, I think, to have.
Yeah, definitely. And it makes you look at your own beliefs and why you believe them, and how, in the centuries that Catholicism and Christianity developed, I mean, there were things that were rejections, right? Like something like the resurrection, and how paganism was like, whoa, this is not like, it was really not acceptable. And so you see that old pagan idea of the body as a prison and you've got to escape it. And the virtue being there, like virtue helping you, but also virtue helping you to hopefully get out of this body someday. And Christianity emerging at just the right time, saying, nope, it's not a prison, right? And you pursue the virtue, but your body's going to be with you. It'll come back. That was a real deal breaker for many pagan philosophers. It was like, why would it? So yeah, definitely.
So to your point about the primary sources being regarded by some as hard or difficult, how do you like to approach that, and speak to the benefits of studying these primary sources? And maybe if you have some ways to approach them, that would be helpful for those of us who might be a little bit daunted by the prospect.
Sure. Well, it is daunting. I know a lot of times families you've got multiple children and they're all in different areas. And I want to say that, so this goal is an education that you can carry with you, that you can chew on as you grow in age and wisdom. And it is going to take an investment of time and energy, right? Like the first time you sit down and read the Iliad and you're like, I'm going to be here a while.
Yeah.
And I have to bookmark where all these names are in the back,
Right.
the
Right.
index, right? And
Yes.
you're thinking, and then you're like, what have I signed up for? I remember all those feelings, and I remember putting off my Virgil's Aeneid reading at UD until like 2 days before, and then deciding I was just going to read it all and falling asleep on my book. And so, yeah, so that's not the way to do it, but it is an education that's going to take an investment of time and energy, and but it's worthwhile. And oftentimes worthwhile things are. I had a professor at UD when I was talking about this to homeschoolers. He pulled me aside later. He was one of my former professors, and he was like, "You need to tell the parents." So this is coming from him. So if anyone gets mad at me, you can track him down. He said, "You need to tell the parents that they need to read these works or listen to them with their children. That can't just be, here's your stuff and go, because it doesn't work that way with these books." I was like, oh, I don't feel like I can do that, but okay, but I think that you do have to, if you're going to study these texts, follow along in some way, whether you are just reading, maybe all you can do is read every week what's happening. I know, and we're talking about strategies. There's reading aloud, and there's if you can find an audiobook of the translation that you have to watch out for your audience, right? When you're reading out loud, like the Iliad, the Odyssey, or Herodotus, you can't just it's not necessarily everyone in the family listening, but if you're in the car together, no, so it will require some parental involvement also, and then it's more rewarding for both of you because you get to have those conversations with your children, not about like, did you do your homework, or where's your soccer shoes or whatever,
Yeah.
but about deeper things. So that's what I can say is it's an education that does require energy and time investment. And it's hard. It is hard. There's ways to scaffold to make it easier, but because it's hard, just you shouldn't become discouraged, right? There's that bestseller out there, was it Do Hard Things? I don't remember who wrote it, but he's like a personal trainer. So we seem to be focusing on our culture on like physical, doing physically hard things, not so much mentally hard. It's mentally hard, and it's okay that it's mentally hard. And it'll take some time. So like I'll say later too, start the reading in smaller chunks. If you have to read a couple books of the Iliad, then figure out how many pages that is and divide it up. And maybe some of it you read aloud together. I had a freshman boy, my first year of teaching, who really struggled. And he and his mom would sit at the counter in their kitchen, and she would read the Iliad book we were reading out loud. We were reading for school out loud. And she ended up really enjoying it. And then they could stop and ask each other questions, or he could say like, wait, who was that again? And he had quite a lot more success after that. And it totally just benefited her to do that. So perhaps it's an education that if you didn't have it, you're going to get to jump in and have some of it, right? And like I said, I know that's not always easy. And then the final quote, this is also from C.S. Lewis too. If you're given proper support and you have the context, I really believe context is really important for a lot of these texts, and you have some scaffolding to help you. Sometimes the sources are not as hard as you might think. I think of like Plutarch. He's really not that hard to read. It's sometimes really, really fun to read Plutarch. He has some fun stories that really, really summarize each person really well, that are memorable. But I have another quote from C.S. Lewis here. He says, "The simplest student will be able to understand, if not all, yet a very great deal of what Plato said. But hardly anyone can understand some modern books on Platonism," which is true. Like if you try to read a book about Platonism, it's like, oh, like just So he says, it has always therefore been one of my main endeavors as a teacher to persuade the young that first-hand knowledge is not only more worth acquiring than second-hand knowledge, but it is usually much easier and more delightful to acquire. So our goal is that it's delightful to acquire. It won't always be delightful, but the way that it will stay with you, the way that you can have these conversations with others about the things that you're reading, that is a delight, right? So it's like, oh yes, the goal is that it can be delightful to acquire knowledge, firsthand knowledge of these sources by reading them. So that's the inspirational part, right? It should be delightful. And then why read hard primary sources? That kind of reading is going to just continue for them as they get into Shakespeare. Shakespeare is not easy. Is it worth reading Shakespeare? I think there's not many people who will say, nah, you don't need him. It's, nah, you're not missing much. So they're going to continue to read books where, how can I say this best? You don't understand every word you're reading, but your goal is to get the sense and the general idea, right, of what someone says or an action that happens. So the skill of summarizing is a really important skill to acquire in high school, and it'll help you a lot in college. One strategy I can talk about later too. Every page, there's a sticky note there. What's the idea, right? What's the general idea? I still use this when I teach the Iliad in high school, even though I've read it plenty of times. I forget which book certain things happen. So here we go. That's where Aries gets involved here. And so I'm a big fan of sticky notes in books with a summary, or if something really important happens, there you go, and in your own words. So distilling the information in the book without getting hung up on every detail and the language of it. It's a really important skill. I think, that you get from reading hard sources.
Okay.
I always think of it kind of like I read a lot going into college, but then all of a sudden it was the Iliad, the Odyssey, Plato, and all of these things. So it's just thick. And it makes me think of like when I tried to get into classical music, where I'm used to mostly listening to pop music, these short little candy pieces of music and then you try to listen to a symphony and it's like, okay, I've lost track of what's going on altogether. But you can build toward it though, so if you keep doing it, it gets easier. And so now I can pick up the Iliad or the Odyssey and it's just like, oh, I was just going to read a couple pages, but I want to see what's going on next here again. But
yeah, it is really similar. I think the parallels with music are really strong, because classical music is something else that it's, the pop songs, it might be fun to hear it on the radio again. Like, oh yeah, I remember this song and I was in high school, and, doesn't stay with you. And when you experience that song in different stages of your life, you don't feel different deep emotions generally, right? It just reminds you of that era. It's really like C.S. Lewis was saying, it's like stuck in its era. Like my students, they don't know any music before like 6 months, right? And forget about it. And if someone was talking about Green Day being a band their parents listened to, that's like my parents' music, and you're like, whoa, Green Day was so edgy, and they were so like that was like a big deal band, right? And it's just they're like, so you're bound to be stuck in your times if that candy, like you're saying, is all you're reading or listening to or watching too, you can say. The amazing thing about classical music, I'd say some jazz too, is you listen to it in high school or you play it in high school. So you play piano or something, and you can maybe technically do it. And like you said, Stephen, you get fatigued listening to it. Like, wasn't this the same as the last one I just heard? And then as you grow and life happens to you and different experiences happen and you keep hearing that piece of music through your life, different things emerge. I really didn't get Beethoven till like 4 years ago. Just thought, my dad loved Beethoven, really loud. I just thought it's so emotional, and wow, I mean, it's loud and emotional, and like too emotional. Just he needs to chill out, And then life starts happening and you begin to see the point of that emotion. You begin to see shades of color to emotion as well. I think great works of art are the same. You can look at a painting and see many different things through your life, and that's why they stay with you, is that it's something you can carry with you, as we've been saying.
Okay, very compelling, very persuasive. I'm with you. I'm with you. So we're going to come back towards the end of our conversation and get some tips from you and you have a whole raft of them to pass along. I'm very excited to hear those. I want to hear though about your book that you have coming out.
Oh, sure. Yes. So I wrote a book. It's a young adult historical fiction book called Phelan and the Miracle Machines, set in Roman Britain and Alexandria in the first century AD. And it was released this spring by Ignatius and Magnificat. And really great journey. I've really enjoyed working with Ignatius. I have a fabulous editor there and really helped me a lot. And so, yeah, it's available at the Ignatius or Magnificat website or anywhere online where books are sold. Yeah, it's been nice to take the stories I saw my students just enraptured by in Greek and Roman history. This is just one of them where they are so used to Harry Potter-like stories where fantastic things happen and none of it happened really, but to realize that fantastic things happened that really did happen, like real humans did this and real humans had this happen to them. Um, I think teaching history with story is really important. And, you know, we not with a textbook, of course, we're not using textbooks at Kolbe in high school as a reference, sure, but it's not your primary source is not a textbook. I think textbooks kill history. They just like make it a list of things you have to know. So the goal being to tell a story about a fictional person, but with real events around him from that era in the 60s AD is when it's set. So yeah.
I almost threw out an amen there with that was fantastic. I love the historical fiction because it I mean, especially as you're preparing, as we talk in our Ignatian terms of a prelection to what you're coming up to. But if you can have those memories of great stories set in the time period that you're going to be going through in history and in other pieces of literature, it seems to just open it up in a way that if it's just I guess that's part of this, maybe the scaffolding you were talking about. It provides some of, maybe not, but context. It provides context. I it's not the same, but I loved reading Greek myths, the children's versions when I was like in fifth and sixth grade or whatever. So maybe not children, but young adult. And even though the stories weren't the same exactly, but then at least when I got to the Iliad, you had I knew some of the characters. I knew the basic story, and then it's like, oh, this is much deeper and more interesting than the earlier ones. But yeah,
Yeah.
I'm I'm looking forward to picking up your book because
Oh,
that would
great.
be a wonderful time to explore.
Well, thank you. No, you're right. I know for my seventh and eighth graders, I start our our Greek humanities class off with reading Nathaniel Hawthorne's version of Baucis and Philemon. It's beautiful. I mean, I love Nathaniel Hawthorne anyway, but it's his Tanglewood Tales. I believe it's in there. I just have the one chapter because I've just photocopied it over the years, and I just read the whole thing out loud to them. It takes like an hour, a little more than an hour, and they just sit there and they just listen. And so I totally agree. Like reading all those adaptations, I don't know, my kids are big fans of the D'Aulaire's, the Norse myths book and their troll book. They're just like, this stuff's crazy, right? And the Greek myths for D'Aulaire's too, and the illustrations. Yeah. Yeah. It's sad with historical fiction, you don't see it a lot anymore. And for young readers, I haven't seen much of it. When I wrote this book, I decided I'd go the traditional way and send it to agents in the Bay Area. Like you have very little chance of writing a book and getting an agent. And I only heard back from one agent, and she said, "This interests me in no way at all." And I was like, well, whatever, because I believed in it. I believed it was a good story. And then I thought, well, I was talking to a friend and I said, I wanted to send it to someone who will respect it, right? Not me and my story, but just preserve what I've tried to work is historically accurate. And she said, well, how about Ignatius? And so I pitched it to them. I've had even other teachers say, the risk of teaching junior high too long is you begin to like sometimes be a junior high student. And I've had other junior high teachers say, well, historical fiction is boring. It's boring. And that wasn't my experience. I liked those old standards, the Bronze Bow, the Eagle of the Ninth, even Witch of Blackbird Pond, Calico Captive. I mean, you can really get lost, right? And you're just like, oh my gosh, the adventure is great, and it really happened. And that's the frosting on the cake for history as a story, is it really happened. And so I just don't agree with that at all. I think that we kind of doom our middle readers to that same error of I go to, with the exception of the Will Wilder books that Raymond Arroyo wrote, that my son loved. He would read them and laugh and read them and read them and stay up too late. When I go to bookstores, it was a lot of like middle school readers set in middle schools. And I thought, oh my gosh, get me out of here. It's claustrophobic, like enough middle school. I didn't want to read more about middle school in middle school. I wanted to like run away at the end of the day and not be in middle school.
Right.
But there seems to be an idea that we can only get them to read if we give them things that are about their lives and what they're experiencing. And number one, not everyone's experiencing the things that are going on in those books. So it's not even, maybe it's introducing the things that aren't good, right? My daughter goes to the library and she's got a stack of books. I'm like, oh, that's great. She's in 7th grade. That's great. And then when she turns her back, I'm like skimming through them really fast and looking at the back and, and then, we're not taking these. And, she'll say, why not? And to say, no, these look good. These look like good adventures. But these other ones, I just don't think the stories are good for your soul. Like they're not going to lift you up. Sometimes kids come to that on their own, but I just think there's a lot out there that's almost purposely misleading kids down paths of things they didn't know existed. And it's too much in their own time. Like I said, they're too close to things. And I know they're trying to help kids learn how to work through problems, but maybe you learn to work through problems by reading about someone in a totally different era that is not like you and went through way worse things than you did, right? So yeah, I totally agree with you about the historical fiction being interesting. And then you think, well, am I a weirdo that I really like those books? But I don't think so. When I ask friends, they'll say, oh, the one that I really liked was, whatever historical fiction book. Everyone will admit that it's better than reading a history textbook. No one I know enjoyed reading history textbooks. And one of our speakers we had that came out to the school one year to talk, he said that he didn't really get into history, and he believes this happens a lot until he was an adult, like well into adulthood. And then of course it was Civil War, World War I, and World War II history, which is like the joke, right? Like dads and grandpas read that. But he's like so into Civil War history. And he said, I think I had to not get it from a textbook. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
My book story is Carry On, Mr. Bowditch. It's which I was listening to with my daughter when she was in middle school, and all of a sudden it's like, this is amazing. I hadn't even thought about these issues that people had before, they could tell where they were, east and west. And I just got so excited about it. I had to delve into more history. And my son introducing me to Revolutionary War, and it's like, oh wait, I can get this book about Alexander Hamilton, and I can really delve in, and I couldn't stop then. But once I could get away from the textbooks, then it was wonderful.
And we have textbooks, of course, like I have textbooks here, but they're for reference for me, or there's a timeline in there, or there's a chart like of how the Roman Republic works. And here's the Senate and here's the assemblies, and that's fine. Charts of the Roman army. Like I can't explain that, like how it's broken down, but here you go. So textbooks for reference for us as instructors. And with pulling out the resources in there, I have binders here in my office of things I've either created or found online or found in textbooks that I will maybe digitize someday. Probably not. I don't know. Maybe that era has passed for me. Have my photocopies. Just keep photocopying like Bacchus and Philemon and doing, and I think for us as parents and teachers, it's being open to refining. I have the benefit of teaching the same thing every couple years. Well, Latin all the time, because I teach 7 Latin classes, 7th through 12th grade. And so you're always like, it didn't work so well. I'm gonna get that out of here. For a homeschooling parent, if you have children close together, you might be able to do that as well. I know not everyone's situation is different, but I think being open to tweaking and refining, like, no, that resource, not so much. This one really worked. I'm going to hang on to it. Maybe it'll help with the next child, right? Or a variety of resources, depending on, I've got some auditory processors who it's rough. It's really rough. They can listen to that Bacchus and Philemon story. If they have a copy, they can read too, right? They can't just listen. It's not possible for them, at least at this point. So yeah, having a variety of resources, but also being willing to prune as you go. So yeah.
Well, let's, at this point, if you have any final thoughts or takeaways for us, any words of wisdom, any suggestions for families who are kind of new to this scene, or like, where do we even start? Anything along those lines. But what do you think there?
Sure. Yeah. So I think as far as if you're new to this, for these ancient works, context is important. The summaries and the course plans are there to help you. They're there to help your high schooler. The introductions and the study guides that Kolbe provides, that you can get from them, the classic CDs, of course, as well. Scaffolding as much as possible. So breaking down assignments to maybe you can't read 60 pages in one night, but you can read 10 pages over 6 nights, right? And maybe some of that is out loud. Like I said, just note your audience. If you have a high schooler and you're reading like the Iliad or the Odyssey, some of the Odyssey is fine, but and Herodotus, I'd say those are your 3. You want to just kind of, maybe it's just you 2 reading it. So trying to vary. So sitting down to read it all at once is not going to be good at all. So breaking it up, annotating as well. I find just get a pile of sticky notes, and when something major happens in the text, summarize it in your own words, like I said. And then if you can find an audiobook, so maybe you have a car drive. This is something I'm working on with my high schooler, because we drive about 20 minutes every morning. That time we pray at the beginning of it, but then we still have 15 minutes. He can turn the radio stations, and why not use it? So we've been listening to podcasts about cybersecurity, because he's like really into cybersecurity. And that's interesting. But if you have schoolwork, you could do that then too. Like I said, if you can find, and I think Penguin is a lot of the text that we use in the homeschool for, if you can find Penguin audiobooks, if you have Audible or something like that, or just have them read it out loud to you or something. And then I think if you find that they're just kind of lost at sea as far as when things happened and where they happened, if you have an idea, maybe it's all going to be overwhelming. I would start with maps and timelines with your freshmen. Why not? If you haven't done, a lot of map and timeline work, or maybe they came from a background where it's just ancient history, ancient literature really wasn't a priority. Make sure they know where things happened, and they can put in a timeline, like Greeks before Romans, Romans before medievals, right? Age of exploration, founding of America. And because sometimes we as adults assume we had to learn that information. Sometimes we just forget. So maps and timelines are always a good place to start for younger students. The book that I've used, I know I talked about early on when we weren't recording, it was created as a homeschool resource. It's Christine Miller's All Through the Ages. Huge book of timelines and maps. It's not overwhelming, no maps, just timelines and reference, like historical fiction, primary sources. I think it's like 1st through 12th grade. I don't remember the age. It's a pretty big age gap she's got broken down that at least made for homeschool families. I think she probably was a homeschooler too. I'm not sure if it's in print, but you can find it used online. That's the copies we have at my school, or just from online that we found.
And for working with maps, what makes a good map study? Like, how do you kind of ingest, basically? How do you kind of get it to that mental image in your mind? Like, I know where that is, that kind of thing.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so I've got a Mediterranean map and a Greece map, and then a Western Mediterranean map and a city of Rome map with the seven hills and the Tiber and everything. So that's like that's one of the processes, right, in these binders is finding a map online where this is going to sound super basic, but I was the student who couldn't tell the ocean, the water from the land, because you're like the land is white and the sea is dark. I don't mind admitting that because now I know as a student, it's
Yeah.
great to not be, sometimes it's great to not be the smartest person in the room because like this tripped me up once. I'm not afraid
Yeah.
to admit it.
Hmm.
Right. So a map where you can see the land, you can see the sea, and they're not easily confused. Coloring in the map too for different regions. So for a Mediterranean map, when you find one online, um, I mean, you find one and then they color in. This will help them further distinguish it. Color in Europe, and then you get over the Hellespont. Color in Asia, Asia Minor, so that they can see the difference. And then I just end up. Even I can do this. Maybe an older student could help with this, scanning the map, identifying like maybe how many sites? 10 or 12 sites on there. Athens, Sparta, Delphi, and then putting a text box, an empty text box over that. So you have a master copy and then that you can study and you go through that map together. Here's our map of the Mediterranean. This is Greece, this is Macedonia, this is Thrace, this is Asia Minor, right? And so making sure they are clear where everything is. You might put major battles on there for the high school. So I have Marathon on there and Thermopylae and put like a X for the battle or something. So once you know what they're looking at and where north is and south is, just all that basic map skills, oceans too, so bodies of water. So I break it down with like geographical features and then cities and battles. And then from that good clear map online, I've just scanned it and put text boxes, picked out what I want them to know, where it's supposed to be, and put the text boxes over the names so they can't see them. And they get multiple attempts at it, sure. Yeah. I mean, if they get it all right the first time, and for me, spelling does count. I let they study for it for at least a week. Spelling counts. Unless I have a student who's really who has dyslexia or something, and then I can do a word bank for someone who's really, you want them to have success. So if they know where Thebes is, you don't want the spelling to be what's like
Yeah.
like, oh yeah, the real struggle. So I've provided word banks in the past when we know someone has an IEP or something, and so they can just pick it from there. Seven Hills of Rome map. I use the map from, what is her name? Do I have it? Oh, just a second. I have the map in. Okay, Genevieve Foster's. I know homeschoolers use this. Augustus Caesar's World. There's a great map of the Seven Hills of Rome in here. I scanned it and I took the names out, and we use that. And I know who's a Star Wars fan when we do that map because it'll always be a Palpatine hill.
Nice.
Like, not Palpatine, Palatine, that's all right, So yeah, once again, like beg, borrow, and steal. When you find a resource, hang on to it. But that helps. And then yeah, it just depends on the child's background in geography too, but all of that has been a help. And then they're oriented in the world, and then they're oriented in history, right? Like and then, like I said, when they're in high school, what you can hopefully see is they start to hang dates in the right place, right? So, and have a good sense of history. So.
Okay. Wow. Fabulous. This has all been great. It's just been such a pleasure meeting you. Thank you so much, Abigail, for coming to spend this time with us, and lovely to hear your voice and to get to visit with you in real time, and appreciate so much the recordings that you made for Kolbe. Our show notes will have a lot of links and notes that, titles of books mentioned, links to things, so forth. So check those out. And again, we really thank you and hope to visit again with you here real soon.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Subscribe to the Kolbecast on your favorite podcast app so that you don't miss an episode. And let us know how we're doing by leaving a rating or a review. And as always, feel free to email us at podcast@kolbe.org.
Mary, our Mother, pray for us. St. Maximilian Kolbe, St. Ignatius of Loyola, holy saints and angels, pray for us. Ad Maiorem Dei Gloriam.